the biggest risk is the United States. So for us, if there's a few things, right? If Trump tries to block the midterms in any way or disenfranchise portions of the population, that will be a huge red flag. If he continues to attack free media, that will be another huge risk point. And the activities of ICE, if they continue, especially, the murders of members of the population, that will be a huge set of red flags. That's probably the top thing we are watching. So trying to see if that shift we saw in 2025 carries through and what that means for the tension between functioning of government and civil liberties.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at geopolitics, international relations, economics, and more, sometimes diving into unique angles and features that shape the world around us. In this episode, I'm delighted to announce the first of many collaborative sessions with The Economist Group, introducing Katherine Stewart, who is the head of impact research at Economist Enterprise, as we unpack the group's flagship Democracy Index report. Now, many of you, if you see a graph or a statistic on the internet, it may well have come from the EIU, which does remarkable work of tracking many different things that we take for granted or simply just sort of consume but don't really think about. The Economist Intelligence Unit provides the global analysis and forecasts on political, economic, and policy developments across more than 200 countries. And one of their flagship products is the Democracy Index. Every year they provide a deep dive into the state of democracy around the world, countries that are trying to improve their democracies, or perhaps those that are backsliding. And in the case of what's just happened in the past 12 hours, and what I want to ask Katherine first about is Hungary. Because no country more than Hungary, could we argue, is a bit of an epitome of a country that has been in a bit of a hybrid system, having democratic values and mechanisms and systems, but seeing them undermined or changed, shall we say, influenced. Katherine, welcome to this program. What do you think about the result, and how does it, I think, tie into all the work you and everyone at the Economist Intelligence Unit have been doing?
It's a great question. And I think for me and for the EIU as a whole, Hungary was a really exciting outcome. So we have been tracking what we are calling a democracy recession for the past 8-9 years around the world. And this year started to indicate, so our 2025 Democracy Index started to indicate that there might be a reversal in that trend. And for me, now a quarter of the way through 2026, what happened in Hungary is a reflection of that backing off of the democracy recession. What do I mean by that? So there were some real patterns that we saw in 2025 that led to that potential bottoming out of the democracy recession. And these were political participation increases in countries around the world, huge amounts of kind of youth participation in politics and in democracy and youth demands that didn't exist before. We saw this in Madagascar, in Kenya, so some wide-ranging countries where that was in play, Nepal. And finally, this kind of reaction to Donald Trump and the Trump administration in the US. And so one of the things for me that I actually called out on Friday was, is there going to be a backlash to J.D. Vance standing up next to Viktor Orban and stating that they were in support together? Is that not what the populace wants? Is that going to force more and more people out? So for me and for the EIU's Democracy Index, what has happened in the last 24 hours in Hungary has been a real reinforcement of some of the trends that we were seeing unfold and that we thought indicated this bottoming out.
Yeah, I was making a video late last night, sort of looking at the speculative aspects of the result. And then when it became apparent just how much of a landslide hammering to Orban it was becoming, I had to completely revise the whole thing and posted it late last night. But, this is a seismic moment for not just Europe or NATO or the war in Ukraine, but for democracy itself. Because for me, it demonstrates that democracy is resilient, or that after periods of centralized power, autocratic tendencies, or what academics have called a liberal democracy, it can come through and the mechanisms work, and it's a reassurance. So when you look at Hungary as a case study, how does it compare to some that have more centralized forms of governance? Like Russia's meant to be a hybrid system, but it's much more obviously autocratic than Hungary is.
So I think this is the interesting thing about looking at democracy as a whole. You look at so we classify democracies into 4 buckets, or classify countries into 4 buckets. We have the full democracies sitting at the top. There's your Nordic states, a lot of Western Europe, Canada are up there in those full democracies. I do want to make it clear, even there, you see ups and downs in the system. And I think Canada is an interesting one in terms of Hungary, because what happened in Hungary last night looks very similar to what happened in Canada a year ago, with Trudeau being voted out. Everyone thought the Conservatives would win in a landslide, and then you had this reversal with Mark Carney. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the aggression of Trump. That's a separate conversation. Then we have these flawed democracies, and those are countries that there are democratic systems in place. The foundations are there. A country like Hungary, where they allow elections. Have they been tampered with in the past? Absolutely. That's why you've had 16 years of Viktor Orban. But the structures are there, and when finally the population mobilizes behind something different, a desire for something different, there's this ability for those countries with their democratic baselines in place to actually really overcome whatever challenges they're facing. I think Russia's an interesting one, because in theory, those structures are there, but I do wonder if they've been eroded down so far, and there's an active war that basically allows Putin to continue holding power rather than facilitating some of this democratic shift. And then you have these, what we call the hybrid regimes. You might call them hybrid systems. And they're the ones that we watch to see, are they starting to try and build up the individual structures that over time will allow them to move into the flawed democracies and really capitalize on some of those systems. And then at the bottom, we have the authoritarians. The authoritarians are interesting in that they don't move much. Sure.
Right.
Sometimes they fall down a little bit. Sometimes they rise up a little bit. It basically depends on the extent to which there's been a coup or something like that. But those are very, very stagnant at the bottom. And so for me, looking at democracies and shifts in democracy, it's those hybrid regimes and the flawed democracies that become really interesting. And especially this idea of, can you move from a hybrid regime into a flawed democracy and stay there and solidify your base? And we have seen some countries do that. Thailand's a really interesting one. So early on in our democracy index, they started to build up a base of true democracy. And then they had those series of protests where kind of the country almost fell apart. There was a coup, it was a mess. And for a bunch of years, it sat back down in the hybrid regimes. But as that began to unfold and a new system came into place, a new government, we saw this shift back up. And now Thailand, for the last 4 or 5 years, has been sitting in those flawed democracies again. So I think there's this proof point. You can build up the systems. They can struggle and fall a little bit, but they're there, they're underneath. And as populist demands change, you can see that coming back into the fore, and these countries are able to push forward, if that makes sense.
No, it does. What I wonder, therefore, is obviously if we break this down more specifically, within each bucket, as you referenced, we have a distribution, a spectrum within each bucket. So, I mean, from my experience of studying things, there's the book from 2012, Why Nations Fail. And it talks about extractive and inclusive institutions. And I'm just going to use Somalia as an example. It's an arbitrary one, but I think it's fascinating because Somaliland, which is not a recognized state, has a more functioning system. you know, you have money, you have a judicial system, you have even sort of a passport, and it looks more like an actual functioning country than Somalia, which is largely a collapsed state. So how do we, at what point does a country become autocratic or authoritarian if it was a flawed democracy, or when does a flawed democracy become more of a hybrid regime? How do you gauge, how do you apply quantitative metrics to qualitative, you know, things like democracy? Because it's quite hard to pin that down, right?
Well, and so I think this becomes a math problem, which, you know, we're the EIU, we like math.
We're the economists,
yeah,
so we've
yeah,
got math
we're
in there,
into
right?
math. So I think there's a math question to this, which is obviously we have 16 metrics that sit within our index, and they are all assigned a certain weighting and a scoring scheme, and you basically add up a country's points, assign the weighting to them, and that is the score they get on a score of 0 to 10. Some of those elements have more weight than others based off of our understanding of democracy. So you look at something like the functioning of government systems, very important in having democracy work. Civil liberties, a huge part of underpinning democracy. And basically what we do is every year we aggregate these elements up, and sometimes countries fall under the thresholds we've assigned, and we assigned 20 years ago almost, to be a full democracy, a flawed democracy, a hybrid regime. And once they slip, we can attribute it to certain changes in their system, but that's sort of how we think about it. Now, I think there's another way to think about it. It's just not what we do, which is to say every full democracy needs to have A, B, and C structures in place. If you do not, you cannot qualify to be a full democracy, even if you have huge amounts of political participation. You have a freedom of a free press, whatever you want to call. And you could do that for these different regimes and see how that impacts where countries fall. But for us, it's sort of this aggregation of all of these elements that we say make up democracy, and where you fall in that math problem, essentially, that defines where we place you as a country.
So we have a lot of non-Western viewers on the program, and to be honest with you, the more things shift with Trump and the transatlantic relationship and those related elements, the term West I find more and more unrepresentative. And the reason I'm saying that is because a lot of people watching or listening might sort of feel that this is a very Western interpretation. When I've hosted Indian academics, for example, they will argue or emphasize that democracy in India is not based on Western liberal democratic model, or there's an assumption that it is, but India is different. Modi has centralized power, but a lot of Indians like that he has sort of centralized power because it helps with the efficiency of running the economy or consistency in policy making. How much do you recognize or consider that this is quite a Western or Western centric stance, or it isn't?
Well, I think this is when it becomes interesting. You're talking to the economist group, right? We have a opinion, which is that traditional liberalism is an effective way to run the world. That has always been the economists and the economist group's perception. That is, you know, the editorial line that the business takes and the newspaper takes. And so for us, I think we would say, absolutely, we understand we have a perception and a bias. We think that there has been proof around the world and throughout history that liberal democratic principles are an effective way to run economies, governments, populations. And so maybe this is a slightly Western bias. I will say a country like India, it still falls into our flawed democracy category. We give credit to a lot of the institutions that Modi's government has in place. It's just that we, as a rule, in our index, believe that having that traditional liberal definition is the most effective way to drive democracy. I'm certainly open to debate on that.
No, of course. That's the point of a podcast and a conversation like this, isn't it? And one of the things that I find interesting is that if we talk about things in this bipolar or multipolar world, a shifting world, all these sorts of grandiose phrases that people are throwing about all the time now. One of the emphases is a sort of third-party states, countries that are looking to sort of the US and Western model, or the China and Russia non-BRICS. I'm using all the buzzwords here. But one of the key elements to this, I think, is sort of, do you want a more centralized form of governance which ensures more consistent economic policy making, right? China only has one party system, but it means that the economy grows because you know that there's not going to be, well, look at Britain, right? We're both in the UK at the moment. And what's happened in London in the past 15, 20 years? Productivity is non-existent. The UK has flip-flopped from different policies because of Brexit and other aggregate issues. The point I'm making is that simply every couple of years, there's a shift in the political ideology, which therefore inhibits consistent policies to be remain, because the next party comes in like, no, we want to repeal that. We want to undo that. Or the United States with Trump and Biden, of course. So when creating a report like this, or looking into the systems around the world, how do you understand different nation states looking at democracy and whether it's better to be a democracy or have a more centralized form of governance? Long-winded question, but I think there's one in there.
So I think it is an index measuring democracy. So as a baseline, what this index tries to capture is this country as democratic as it could be? It doesn't look at economic growth per se, right? Some of these other metrics that are really interesting that you put into place. Now, I think if we wanted to build an effective state index, that would be a very different question. What you might put in is exactly metrics: productivity, GDP growth, inflation, wages, etc. So all of cost of living, all of those metrics, I think, are really relevant to looking at effective states. But what this specific project or product measures is how democratic is a country.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, I think, not necessary, but a kind of a systemic trade-off between
Right.
if you allow people, and this is a really good moment to talk about the US, if you allow people and believe they have the right to vote based on their belief system, you do not have an economic structure that includes them or a governmental structure that provides social services. So they are consistently not disenfranchised, but they are consistently struggling with living with, their well-being. You are going to get that flip-flop that you talked about between, you have the Democrats on one side, the Republicans. They have very little these days, at least, in common in what their policy base does. And you have that set of voters that sits in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Georgia, who basically vote back and forth between the two groups because they are never included in whatever set of policies and growth happens in the country. And so they are these kind of not disenfranchised, but almost ignored populations. And that makes this conflict between effective states and democracy very, very interesting.
Well, yeah, on this point, as always, in any major metric system from any major media outlet, the United States is always an anomaly, be that about crime or economic growth or democracies. How much does the United States variance compared to other more Western orientated countries or associated with the West? How much does that distort the global picture then?
Does it distort the global picture? Not really. What it does do is distort the media. But if you were to look at a visual of the aggregate average score of our flawed democracies and our full democracies from the index's inception to today, you would see that average aggregate score is extremely steady, really quite steady in the high sevens type of out of 10 situation. The US started much above that high sevens figure back in 2006. So it was up in the kind of, and what you've seen in the US over time is just kind of a steady decline down to where it's sitting today. So the US, I think, is different to the rest of that group. I wouldn't have said that was true historically. it has been true very much since the election of Donald Trump the first time round, which started a steady decline in the way institutions are applied. Now, I do think it would be really interesting, though. We didn't have this index back in the Nixon era. I do think if we looked at the U.S. in the Nixon era, there would have been some very similar trends to what we are seeing today. And so I sort of wish we had a retroactive democracy index to be able to look at the story in the United States.
Yeah, it's fascinating because for much of my lifetime I've been brought up in what one guest we had on in another conversation, the exception, not the norm, about the US primacy, unipolar world. And now, or since 2008, a lot of people point to that as the first real, you can argue perhaps the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, but there have been inflection points that have triggered the shift in the balance of power or perception of the United States and therefore the West more collectively. Deglobalization occurring over the 2010s, the rise of populism, and therefore a de-democratization, if that's the right word to use, or democratic backsliding becoming much more prevalent, especially since the mid-2010s. Do you think that we're seeing a reversal of that now, 10 years later?
I do. So I think that there is enough, and this is in the world -1. So this is not true in the US. Although I think there will be trends that come out in the midterms that will align with what we're seeing in the rest of the world. I think what we are seeing now is a highly active youth population that is demanding change based off of what their world vision is, who are mobilizing to come out and to challenge the existing status quo. Now, how much that pushes the functioning of government, civil liberties forward remains to be seen. Now, do these leaders who have been elected in react to the demands of the populations that have pushed them into office? I don't know yet, but I do think there's been a rejection of populism. You've seen it around the world. I mean, Bolivia, after 19 years of a populist leader, had free elections in 2025. That's a huge shift. You saw it in Hungary last night. You've seen the demands in Nepal. You see them in Madagascar. You see them in Kenya. You've seen more political participation in the April 2025 Canadian election that you've seen since 1993, when one of the issues they were considering was the secession of Quebec, right? So you're seeing these shifts in how people are engaging, and whatever's driving that shift might be unique to the context of the country or the region. So even in Europe here, where we saw in 2025 in Western Europe a pretty politically deactivated group these days, increased participation in countries that were at the forefront of kind of threats from the US. So Denmark with Greenland. So that might not be what's driving every country, but it certainly shows this shift around the world in places outside of the United States towards a more engaged, demanding populace that is looking for change.
Well, that leads neatly into the next question, but to frame it, for me, I'm born in 93, so I'm on the younger end of millennials and in a very unique time of power change or geopolitical shifts. I'm a pride product of the Cold War, and my parents being half English Russian, I think it's quite an interesting mix. Like, I wouldn't, unless those major events hadn't happened in the way that they did. But Gen Z and now Alpha as well are a fascinating illustration of just how much political participation is growing. Polarization still seems to exist in an extent. And what I mean by that is we look at Britain right now. Who are the main frontrunners in the next election? I mean, it's a couple of years away, so I don't take too much read into it. It's the Greens, and not like a moderate Greens in Germany or something. They are left-wing Greens. And Reform. Although Reform is being undermined by Restore Britain, Rupert Lowe, and other more sort of right-wing entities as well. So, yes, political participation is higher, but we seem to still be seeing a phase of a return to the fringes, whilst the centre is being carved out or undermined. Or you disagree with that?
I think yes and no, which is not a helpful question or not a helpful answer. Yes, in that, sure, there is the traditional center is not attractive to a lot of people right now. However, one might ask, is that because the political center seems quite weak? So you talk about the UK. Keir Starmer was elected in sort of what would have been considered sort of landslide for Britain. And I do not think he's been particularly effective in his role as prime minister. And so what could have been a real mobilization of a wide range of the populace back towards the Liberal Party didn't occur. Now, you can argue why that might have occurred, but what it basically does is it takes an already political center and sort of further antagonizes people either to the left or the right of it. You've seen it in the US as well. I mean, that's what Donald Trump was in a lot of ways back in 2016. It was this reaction to a center, the moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans who have been in office for the better part of 20, 30 years. It was that reaction to it's not meeting our needs. We're going to try something different. Now, sure, is this ongoing conversation about populist parties going to continue? I absolutely think it is going to. I mean, that's what I'll be watching in Europe over the next year or so. But you've seen a rejection of that in Hungary. I mean, the new Hungarian president, he's not that fundamentally different from the populace. He's just slightly more centrist.
Fair. No, that's an important distinction. What I find interesting, therefore, is if we revisit the Trump effect as well as the Vance effect, they both have their fantastic effects. Which is in the case of Trump, he seems to be such a unique version of populism. I think it was an article in The Economist from 10 years ago or just after he'd won the election, and there was the distinction that yes, Brexit and Trump were an illustration of populism rising and a rejection of the establishment or more traditional forms of governance, whatever, but that Trump was a different form of populism because he's such a unique character. And what I mean by that is simply that he is such a bull in a china shop. He is taking a torch, a flamethrower to so many things that you even have what we would consider populists or, fringe parties. I like to balance the words that I use because some people don't like them being classified as populist, but people who are more associated with the Trump or anti-establishment, like Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, ex-Orban, these are all people who, well, maybe not Orban, but people have so much antipathy to Trump and his threats towards Europe. Essentially, Trump is pushing more what we would associate with populism in Europe towards the idea of a federal united Europe. He's literally forcing them to be like, well, we want to put Europe first then. But this is insane because what does that demonstrate about interpretations of democracy and populism and this sort of thing? Another garbled question there, sorry.
I think it demonstrates that irrespective of who's in power, most people have some feeling of loyalty to their country. And how that loyalty manifests is going to look very different for different people, different places. But when you come under threat from an outside party, and Trump in this case is an outside party, there is a natural bonding together of I trust my fellow Canadian more than I trust anyone else. And so, you know what? We are bonded together because you are threatening Canada. And it doesn't matter if we don't agree on immigration. We agree that we don't want to be American, right? Fine. Same idea with Denmark, right? We don't necessarily, Denmark's quite fraught. They have the same sort of populist challenges that most of the rest of Europe has. However, they're in agreement on one thing. They do not want Greenland to be American, right? And you keep seeing this, in Hungary. We have already been, in a lot of ways, been puppets to the Russians. We do not want to be puppets to Donald Trump. And you can continue saying this for all of these examples, which is basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that that overcomes these kind of factionalist politics within a lot of these countries. And that's been the Trump effect that is so interesting. And so for me, you look at Latin America, Trump has already deposed of the president, replaced the president in Venezuela. He has his sights set on Cuba. Cuba's got its own set of problems. But if he were to turn to other places in Latin America, it is very possible we'd see the same sort of effect we've seen in Europe, in Canada, which is this bonding together to say, whatever our problems are, they're less problematic than Donald Trump taking over.
So I asked you earlier in the conversation about, the rise of populism, what the anti-globalization, anti-establishment shifts were occurring in a lot of the 2010s, the fragmentation that was really beginning to develop, the globalization myth or paradox, a couple of great books that I've read and have been written on that. And I'll use Latin America, since you referenced it as a case study, to frame the question, which is simply that in the post Second World War era, you could argue that Latin America has been defined by a pendulum from left to right, the blue tides, the pink tides, as it's colloquially known or academically known. Simply put, is Latin America a demonstration that we just go through swings and roundabouts? We just go back and forth. So we're now coming back into a more pro-democracy era, but after a generation, new people are born, people experience, we'll go back to more of a populist thing again, because people get just fed up or frustrated with the prevailing system.
My opinion on that as an American by birth is yes. And that the reason I say as an American by birth is I think the American system in particular, the one I grew up in, was always designed never to move too far to the left or too far to the right. It always pushes you back to the middle. And I think what we will see in November, assuming that Trump doesn't try and completely disrupt the elections or disenfranchise an entire portion of the American population, which I think is unlikely to happen. You will see this shift back, a complete rejection of the insanity that's happening with Trump. But I think that happens anywhere in the world. And the reason it happens, this is the one thing I really remember from 9th grade history, is if you have democracy down at the bottom of the chain here, right? Or you put it at the top if you prefer to put it at the top, if we assume it's better than some of the alternatives. You move to the left and you move to the right. And the further to the left and the further to the right you get, you actually end up at the bottom where like communism and fascism are exactly the same thing under different names. And once you get towards these fringe points, it seems dangerous to people. And so they automatically start to shift back the other way and see the center as being perhaps less scary. And then they'll see the center isn't meeting their needs. They'll move out again. They'll start to look for these fringe beliefs and systems and leaders. But ultimately, if it gets too risky, you get too close to that authoritarianism, you start to see the back off again and the return. And I think that's what's so interesting about the authoritarian countries. They never get the chance to get onto that circle, right? Because they're always stuck down in this authoritarianism at the bottom. And that's quite hard to fight out of unless you have something else to fight for and with.
So what's the point of covering all this if it's just a natural case of going back and forth between one phase of democracy supported and then another where we're losing faith in democracies?
Because people care, and it's a long time between those swings. I mean, we've been talking about the democracy recession for almost 10 years. That probably makes it a depression, not a recession, actually, if I think about it, but that's okay. But that's a decade is a long period of time. And I think people still want to see, is there a moment or an indication that that shift is going to happen? Or is there a way to accelerate that shift back towards something that feels a little bit more stable? Because when we get to these points in time where we are closer to the populist fringe points than we are to the democratic centrist norm, it is more volatile. It is more uncomfortable. You see, I mean, this is probably something very interesting that you see, operational risk and kind of business environments start to crumble in countries, especially the more flawed democracies and hybrid regimes, as you get towards that deterioration of democratic systems. That leads to things like inflation, it leads to unemployment, it leads to conflict, that people are uncomfortable in that area. And so they are looking for, when are we going to shift back the other way? And I think that's the reason you cover this, is because it is important.
No, I wouldn't be me if I wasn't slightly provocative in my framing of some questions. But yeah, we've covered a lot of the normative aspect, or sort of the theoretical, the conceptual. To put this into numbers again, obviously the economy, the political economy, something that I think has become very prevalent in the post-Cold War era is the idea of political economy. So you mentioned about how democracy is linked to economic and operational risk. So how should businesses, investors, I mean, I don't even look at my investments with the state of the war in Iran right now, but like, how should people be feeling? Optimistic, indifferent, pessimistic?
I actually think this is not about your investment portfolio. I think this is about the supply chain. So all of these businesses are dealing with volatile geopolitical situations that are impacting their supply chains. And what we are saying, and what we have found in our analysis this year, looking at the democracy index and operational risk, is that falls in democracy historically have been leading indicators for increased operational risk. And to me, that's where this becomes interesting, because if you have a little bit of advanced warning about the potential risk of increased operational risk, then you have this ability perhaps to diversify your supply chain and adjust it earlier. And so I am not sure what it tells us about your investment portfolio. I haven't looked at mine either since the war in Iran started. But I do think what it tells us is there are these little signals that say there is a potential risk point for your operations that could occur in this country. Is it a moment to diversify away from that country to protect your ability to continue operating as a business? And for businesses operating in such a volatile environment, I think those little signals can be extremely helpful. And so that's more of how I've been thinking about it.
But which defines which? The economy and its influence on politics helps strengthen the idea of democracy, or is it the political environment and its capacity for consistent economic policy that defines faith in democracy? Because, and if I can just add one point to that, isn't because over the 2010s, what was it defined by? The remnants and recovery after 2008, austerity, especially in the sovereign debt crisis of the European Union in 2011, 2012. And so people, I mean, the rejection of, in Greece, obviously, when the far left party came into power, they were going to reject the IMF loans and capitulating or conforming to this. But then when they realized that they didn't have a choice, that resulted in a rejection of the fringe back to the center.
I mean, I think there's a mutually reinforcing circle here, as you've noted. But I do think that there are structures that the moment they start to fall, and our analysis seems to indicate that if democratic structures, the functioning of government systems start to fall, it is much harder to prop up economic systems and operational systems within a country. Whereas the reverse, you can do it. It makes it harder, but it is doable. That once there's indication of recession, that doesn't necessarily bring down your functioning of government.
So are we seeing a structural divide between stable democracies and stable authoritarian systems with this sort of instability in the middle?
Yes, we do. So you'll see, and it's very interesting, like the authoritarian states, the Gulf states, for instance, all authoritarian. Very stable operating environments for the most part, exception now that Iran's in the picture. But generally, that group of countries is the biggest exception to the rule here around increase or decreases in democracy driving increases in operational risk. But you look at that middle bucket of countries, your kind of hybrid regime countries, you see this again and again and again, that there are falls in democratic systems that lead to increases in operational risk that result in an additional increased turmoil that take a while for countries to get through and sort of work their way back up the system. That seems to be the most common thread that we are seeing in the democracy index.
And so what are the biggest risks that could reverse that stabilization over the next year? Obviously a new report, a new index will be brought out. Hopefully we'll return to this in the weeks and months ahead. I think this is a very pertinent conversation. It's evergreen, right? It's not something that is out of date after tomorrow. But yeah, how are you looking at the biggest risks?
I mean, the biggest risk is the United States. So for us, if there's a few things, right? If Trump tries to block the midterms in any way or disenfranchise portions of the population, that will be a huge red flag. If he continues to attack free media, that will be another huge risk point. And the activities of ICE, if they continue, especially, the murders of members of the population, that will be a huge set of red flags. So that's probably the top thing we are watching. We will watch Europe to see if this shift against the fringe parties and the extreme right continues post Hungary. If it does, I think that bodes really well for the democratic recovery. We will be watching what is happening with the youth protests out in Asia and in countries across Africa. So trying to see if that shift we saw in 2025 carries through and what that means for the tension between functioning of government and civil liberties and continued demands from the populace. And then finally, we'll be watching the Middle East. And the Middle East is interesting because it is basically full of authoritarian regimes. I do not think that there is any indication that the US and Israel invasion of Iran is going to do anything to shift and drive regime change in a country like Iran, but we will be looking to see if there's any kind of incremental progress across the Middle East on some of these countries that have historically been in wars, that could show a slight chipping away up the chain towards more democratic systems. So to me, those are the big things to watch.
My penultimate question is simply that when you look at things from a more private sector or business framing, in recent years, when asked, polls have often not really mentioned geopolitical risk or political risk more broadly. It's always been specific economic shocks or things like climate change or terrorism. Do you think that there's still an underestimating of political risk towards businesses?
No, I don't. So everything I have seen recently, and one of the roles that my team does is we run kind of custom research programs and thought leadership programs that are editorially independent, but they are client supported. So we have seen a turn towards more and more questions around issues like volatility, supply chain risk, political instability in the past 12 to 15 months than I have seen since, probably 10 years ago. So I think that people are realizing this is their number one business risk right now.
Okay, interesting. And my last question is simply as a nice way to sign off as we started, to bring it back to Hungary. But as a case study, is there one specific metric, one specific indicator that you think can determine whether a democracy is genuinely recovering, or it is very much dependent upon the region, the country, the time of the world that we're in?
That's a really good question. I mean, if I had to choose one indicator that is most leading, it would be free elections, right? Are there free elections, and is the transition of a free election allowed to occur in a country? If the answer is yes, you get your Hungaries. If the answer is no, I think you have indication that there's some trouble ahead, or a fight to be had, and a potential risk to democracy. So obviously we think 60 indicators are important. We have 60 indicators in our index, but if I had to choose the one, that's the one I would choose.
Very good point to end on. And as always, everyone watching, thank you so much. Do like and subscribe the video, but more importantly, do check out The Economist, and specifically The Economist Intelligence Unit's latest update, publication of the Democracy Index. Some incredible work here from Katherine Stewart and her team. And really, I think what most of us just sort of use or have as a reference point to understand whether we're enjoying our lives on a daily basis or not. And well, I'm very delighted that this is the first of many more conversations with people as informed and easy to talk to. I think that was one of the best things. You break it down for us, Katherine, in a way that's very accessible, and I really appreciate that. Everyone for watching. This is the Global Gambit. We'll speak soon. Take care.